This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. I was in the hospital to visit my grandmother for the last time. The illness was quietly but relentlessly winning, and the entire family had gathered to say goodbye. I sat by her bed when suddenly I heard screams coming from the neighboring room, a gut-wrenching animalistic roar filled with pain and despair. The sound was so horrifying it stole my breath. Unable to bear it, I ran into the corridor. Medical staff was already rushing in that direction, and soon the scream faded and people began to disperse. Shaking, I caught part of a conversation between two nurses. They were talking about a patient who had been in a coma for 10 years and had suddenly awakened. They explained his scream by saying he'd come to while reliving traumatic memories. Memories of a fire where he lost his legs, an arm, and his eyes. One of the nurses mentioned that the police had visited him more than once, as he'd been the key witness to the fire, rumored to have been no accident. But someone had been paying for his stay in the hospital all this time. Returning to my grandmother, I couldn't shake the thoughts of the man in the next room and the horrifying secrets he might be keeping. Night had already fallen over the city, and the cold hospital light sparsely illuminated the road outside the windows. Finally, I couldn't stand it. Promising myself I'd only be a few minutes, I crept into the hallway and cautiously made my way toward the man's room. There wasn't a nurse in sight. I quietly cracked the door open and stepped into the darkness of the room, not suspecting that this decision would change my life forever. As soon as I took a few steps inside, a steady, firm voice rang out. "Did you come to finish the job?" I froze, unsure of what to say. Then I stammered that I'd just heard his story and felt curious to learn more. Cold sweat broke out on my skin, and a sinister silence filled the room, broken only by his heavy breathing. When he fell silent, I stood there, feeling unbelievably awkward. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the mangled outline of his body beneath the white hospital sheet, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. At one point, I thought it best to leave, but he spoke again, calmer and softer this time, asking me to help. He pointed to a machine by his bed and asked me to press a few buttons. Strangely, he knew exactly where the buttons were, as if he could see them through his mutilated face. I hesitated, thinking about calling for someone, but he countered, "I'm a doctor myself. No need to trouble the nurses with such trivialities." Obeying his request, I pressed the buttons, only later realizing that I had increased his morphine dose. The thought struck me. I felt like an accomplice in something strange and wrong. It turned out he was in tremendous pain, but he endured it silently, and that frightened me even more. Gathering my courage, I asked his name, and he told me to call him Father Bartholomew. The name surprised me, and catching my reaction, he explained that he had been both a doctor and a priest, tending not only to bodies but to souls. His voice carried a faint trace of pride, almost satisfaction. For a moment, it seemed like he enjoyed telling me about himself. Trying to fill the uneasy silence, I asked what kind of doctor he had been. The man seemed to ponder for a moment before saying he was a distinguished physician who helped the elderly, the weak, and the mentally ill at his care home, once considered one of the most progressive. He added with pride that he'd had success in treating those who, in his words, suffered from deviant inclinations. At those words, I felt as though I'd been struck by lightning. He mentioned that he had successfully treated homosexuality, calling it a disease. I couldn't stay silent and said that it wasn't a disease, just an orientation, and that it was completely normal. But he cut me off sharply. His response was cold and firm. "That's your opinion. I follow science. The World Health Organization agrees with me. It's a disease that must be eradicated." I felt my hands shaking. Everything inside me protested against his words, but something held me in place, as if I were trapped by his strange gaze and his equally strange beliefs. I stood beside his bed, trying to understand what drove this man to say such things. Perhaps the years spent in a coma had stripped him of reality. He was stuck in a past century and simply hadn't yet learned how much the world had changed. To distract him and myself from these dark thoughts, I decided to ask another question, naively hoping for a less disturbing answer. but he seemed only too pleased to continue. Bartholomew began to describe his care home, built from several interconnected buildings with no way out. The patients lived in their own homes, went to a cafe, swam in the pool, and engaged in everyday activities. But everyone who served them was part of the medical staff. He, the head physician, played the role of a priest, Holy Father, as the patients called him. They would come to him for confession, and this is how he collected information about their mental state, their fears, and their weaknesses. His story took on increasingly sinister shades, as if it hid a dark and terrible truth. He spoke of the care home with such pride, but there was a hint of mockery in his tone toward those under his control. At some point he fell silent, as though waiting for me to ask the next question, as though I would eagerly seek to know how it all ended. I couldn't stop the wave of questions that surged within me, and I spoke again, trying not to betray my horror. "But surely the patients could have figured out they were trapped," I blurted out. In response, he only smiled smugly, pressing a finger scarred with burns to his lips, as if to show that there were still many secrets I couldn't possibly comprehend behind his words. And I felt even more helpless before this man, as if I were sinking into his dark world, where his entire existence revolved around playing games with other people's lives and destinies. Curiosity wouldn't let me go, and I asked him how he could have become a priest, as that required not only knowledge but an understanding of the Bible. He sneered as if I'd asked the most foolish question, and told me that the real Bible wasn't necessary. He'd created his own Bible with commandments of his own design, and instead of a service, he conducted a general medical examination. Under the guise of communion, he gave his patients medicine, so they became his flock, obediently following his every order. "You should have seen how they stood before me, obedient and ready to carry out my every command," he said with pride, and I felt a wave of horror rising within me. At some point, I realized I couldn't hold back any longer, and asked him directly what exactly he had done in that care home. He didn't answer immediately, as though calculating how much I was worth telling. "Treatment must be effective," he said with chilling confidence, and there was something sinister in his voice, as if he spoke of his talents as a doctor and pharmacist with the same pleasure a killer takes in discussing his craft. It felt as though each of his words seeped into my mind like poison, tainting everything I had once believed. For the first time in my life, I felt I was standing before a true monster, someone calmly recounting his achievements without a flicker of doubt. I wanted to run, but my legs seemed glued to the floor. And then he began to talk about his patients. His voice was steady, almost dreamy, as if he were reminiscing about something precious and dear to him. He said he had created an ideal world for them, a world where they were obedient and happy, like children devoted to a loving but strict father. To maintain this idyllic state, he used a special drug he called Omega Compound. The drug induced a mild euphoria, dulled negative memories, and made them forget anything that might cause fear or pain. According to him, they began each day like a blank slate, with no past, no memory of their mistakes or losses. But the most terrifying part was that it wasn't just forgetfulness. Bartholomew explained that the drug's effects didn't stop at amnesia. With increased doses of the Omega Compound, patients became completely suggestible, excessively happy and obedient. He created ideal, compliant citizens, ready to follow his every command, abandoning their own will and minds. It would be true, pure, and righteous communism, Father Bartholomew sighed dreamily. For a moment, images of those people flashed through my mind, helpless and vulnerable. People who he could command to forget their own names or betray their loved ones if he wished. The thought was so terrifying that I nearly screamed, but I forced myself to stay still, gripping the edge of the blanket in my hands. I stood, unable to tear my gaze from his disfigured face, trying to justify his words by telling myself that perhaps he had just lost touch with reality. But the longer I listened, the more I sensed he was fully aware of everything he did. Desperately, I searched his words for a hint of regret or remorse, but he spoke of his achievements with such calm and pride that it took my breath away. My thoughts drifted back to his patients. A suspicion flickered in my mind that there were things happening in the care home so horrific that even he, this Bartholomew, understood they couldn't be shared with outsiders. I tried to think of another question, one that wouldn't be so dangerous. And almost without thinking, I asked him how the patients could have remained unaware of their confinement. He smirked again, as if I'd asked a childish question. Then, looking at his sneer, I fully understood that he saw me as a child who had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. He continued, explaining almost dismissively that patients could go anywhere they wished, visit their homes and the cafe, and use the pool. But everything around them was just a set piece. The waiters, the gardeners, the cleaners, all were medical staff, and none of the patients ever knew. I felt a chill, as though ice-cold fingers were crawling over my skin. His words echoed in my head like a drumbeat, making me tremble with fear. And he continued, describing how the patients, according to him, were happy and obediently carried out his every request. To them, he was an authority, a figure they revered and could never disobey. They came to him for confession, and he knew everything necessary to maintain their dependency and suggestibility. And I suddenly realized he wasn't just speaking as a doctor, but as something much more. There was something almost religious in his tone, as if he had played the role of God to these poor souls. Perhaps he even enjoyed believing that he was fulfilling some higher purpose, even if it meant breaking and controlling other people's lives. I tried to hide my unease and, attempting to divert his attention, asked why the patients had never tried to leave the care home. He replied that it was impossible since there was only one door to the outside, and an attendant was always stationed there. Whenever someone approached the door, they would be met with, "It's not working today," and the person would leave, never asking further questions. There was a cold, sinister mockery in his voice as he described how the patients obediently returned to their daily routines, completely forgetting they had tried to leave. I felt my breath grow uneven. All my doubts melted away. I understood that before me was not a doctor, not a priest, but a real monster who had shattered dozens of lives and, it seemed, took pride in it. And the most frightening part was that he felt no remorse. He relished his story, savoring each word. I suddenly remembered an exchange trip to Germany and a visit to one of those grim museums with photos of atrocities. Those images felt like the monster sitting before me. Father Bartholomew looked at me, and I tried to convince myself that perhaps he simply didn't understand that his actions were wrong, that he needed help, his mind distorted by morphine and countless injuries. Pity and compassion battled with fear inside me, and filled with these mixed emotions. I decided to stay by his side, hoping to help him see his error. "Could you tell me more about your care home?" I asked, trying to sound interested. My tone must have flattered him because he eagerly began describing how he'd built the home from several buildings that formed an entire neighborhood. Every building, every corner was designed to create an illusion of freedom, though there was no actual way out. The patients were stripped of even the faintest possibility of escape, locked in a world where everything was under his control. And I suddenly realized he wanted even more. Telling me about his care home wasn't enough. He enjoyed controlling my perception, my understanding of what was happening. I didn't know if I could endure this ordeal, but I felt that leaving now would be scarier than staying. It was as if this man, no, this creature, required my presence as a witness to his successes, an audience for his most brutal memories. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked why the patients hadn't started questioning the strange nature of their neighborhood. After all, the lack of an exit and restricted social interaction could have seemed suspicious. He answered with unshakable certainty. To prevent questions, the treatment must be as effective as possible. Only then will they trust the doctors and stop doubting. At those words, I felt a deep, real terror. His voice was steady and confident, as if explaining something self-evident. But I understood that beneath this confidence was not just cruelty, but true enjoyment in having absolute control over others' wills. Standing there, listening to him, I suddenly remembered a moment from childhood. I had watched a puppet show where the dolls danced and spoke as if they were alive. Back then, I'd felt an inexplicable fear. The fear that something familiar and safe might actually be something entirely different. This man in front of me evoked that same feeling. He was alive, yet missing something essential, something human, making him even more terrifying. Then he began talking about the treatment process itself. His words were cold and calculated. He explained how he paired pain with conditioned responses, teaching his patients to associate every action he deemed destructive with unbearable suffering. If someone, for example, was prone to alcoholism or television watching, he induced aversion through pain. He had special rooms equipped with pain-inducing devices to create these responses. In his words, these were conditioning chambers, a thinly veiled term for torture rooms. Only after the patient had learned was he given the omega compound, which clouded the mind and forced them to forget the agony they'd endured. Suddenly, to break the silence, I asked him what he remembered of his life before the care home. Hoping to hear something that might show a flicker of humanity, I clung to this question like a lifeline, but his answer only plunged me into deeper horror. "I am a doctor and a priest," he replied with icy certainty. "My duty is to heal and guide to the true path. I have no past, just as my patients have none. I am their only light and their only meaning. To carry out this duty, I gave up all that was human." Flashes of those very videos from World War II museums sped through my mind. The ones I'd seen in Germany, showing the horrors of Hitler's regime. I was on the verge of fleeing this room, but his gaze seemed to hold me in place. Leaving now felt unthinkable, as though my presence validated his significance. He smiled as if reading my thoughts, and something in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. Noticing my state, he suddenly broke the silence and, almost as if in passing, said that his patients, by following his commandments, had become ideal members of society. He repeated that every day began anew for them, and that any memory of the past was merely a faint, hazy image. I couldn't believe his words. It felt like some sort of nightmare, and here I was, a mere observer. His stories were too horrific to be true, yet everything in his tone, his manner of speaking, his confidence, left me with no doubt. This was reality. His reality. I suddenly remembered a man I had seen in the hallway, a tall figure with sharp, angular features as if carved from stone. I decided I had to ask about him, hoping this person might shed light on the situation. "Do you often interact with those who come to see you?" I asked carefully. His gaze hardened for a moment and he replied, "An old acquaintance visited recently. We discussed matters that concern only the two of us. You were right to come and visit me. It was indeed necessary, but don't worry. He won't harm you." He said this with a tone that sent icy fear through my entire being. Until that moment, I hadn't realized that someone might actually harm me just for asking this patient questions. I took another step back, trying to keep my distance from the bed, muttered a faint goodbye and slipped out into the hallway. Once in the hallway, I felt a veil lift from my eyes. I returned to my grandmother, but my thoughts were consumed by the realization that I now held a secret capable of shattering any semblance of normalcy in my life. His voice echoed in my mind, and the terrible meaning behind his words clung to me like a sticky fear, a guilt for having met a monster and letting him leave his mark on my soul. Back with my grandmother, I tried to hide my turmoil, though inside everything felt twisted. Relatives were leaving, having noticed my absence, so I volunteered to stay with my grandmother for the night to smooth things over. We sat in silence, the TV murmuring softly, discussing trivial things. But my mind wouldn't let go of Father Bartholomew's room and the story he'd told me about his project. Sleep crept over me slowly, and I curled up in the chair, drifting off to the hum of the television. At some point, I heard a strange sound from the hallway, and a sense of dread brought me to full wakefulness. Quietly, so as not to disturb my grandmother, I slipped out of the room and saw the corridor was empty. I walked to the nurse's station, but it too was deserted. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned to see a tall man in a leather jacket and sweatpants, with harsh, almost crude features, as if chiseled from stone, moving slowly down the hallway before disappearing behind a ward door. He looked as if he were made of marble and metal, exuding a sense of inhuman strength within his massive frame. The door to Father Bartholomew's room was still swaying, and I realized he'd gone inside. Without hesitation, I approached the room and peered quietly inside, bracing myself for anything. Father Bartholomew was alone, but his expression had changed, as if he'd just experienced something significant. His voice was quieter, yet filled with a strange confidence as he said he had just spoken with an old acquaintance. He didn't offer details, but from his tone I understood that the conversation had been important to him. Fighting the turmoil within me, I confessed that I'd come because I thought he might be in danger. His face twisted into a mocking smile, as if the idea of anyone considering him vulnerable amused him. He replied with a condescending tone that perhaps I was useful to him after all, though he hinted that it would take far more than the man in the leather jacket to truly pose a threat to him. Then he extended a business card to me. It was stark white, with only a faintly embossed phone number visible. If you ever encounter someone mentally unstable, someone who poses a danger to society, he smiled with that same eerie, patronizing smirk. Don't hesitate. Call. I'm always here to help. I didn't know what to say, so I simply took the card, not wanting to offend him. It felt as if I were holding a curse in my hand, something that could alter my fate at any moment. And I understood that he was leaving me a choice, a path into his horrific world, a web in which he executed his own brand of justice and punishment, shaped by his twisted morality. For when you inevitably face the darker side of this world, he added. There was something both calming and terrifying in his voice, as if he knew I would have to use it someday. I held the card, feeling its cold, almost marble-smooth texture, and understood that Father Bartholomew had prepared me to face something that would change my life forever. Back in the corridor, my heart raced, as if I were about to take the final step before plunging into an abyss. My life before meeting him seemed infinitely distant and unreal. I returned to my grandmother's room, but as I drifted to sleep, I realized that he had already become a part of my consciousness, leaving an indelible mark on my soul. The next morning, when other relatives arrived, I went home, but thoughts of that conversation wouldn't leave me. I spent the entire day working at the flower shop, where I had a job as a florist, but I couldn't focus. My fingers trembled, bouquets fell apart, and my mind kept returning to that horrifying conversation. It was as if every flower I touched lost its color and withered, as though the work no longer mattered to me. At one point, a man entered the shop, short, wearing a cap with sharp, confident movements. He seemed to look at the bouquets with a faint, mocking amusement. I immediately felt a strange tension, as if I were suddenly near a predator ready to pounce. Sensing that the odd customer was waiting for me to approach him, I took a step forward, trying to appear normal, struggling to keep the tremor from my voice. When he turned, I noticed a large scar running across his face, as if left by a burn. He looked about 50, but something cold in his gaze seemed beyond age. He asked me a few simple, trivial questions about the bouquets, and I did my best to answer, feeling that this exchange was more than just small talk. He paid for a bouquet, left a generous tip, and walked out, and I finally exhaled in relief, as if I'd just been released from the grip of a predator. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that he was just a regular customer and nothing more. But as I left work and happened to glance toward the trash bin across the road, I thought I saw the very bouquet he'd bought lying there, which would mean he hadn't come for the flowers at all. My unease surged to unimaginable levels once more. I forced myself to get into the car and drive home, trying all the way to convince myself that this was all just coincidence. But it didn't help. Father Bartholomew's voice lingered in my head, and the feeling that I was now connected to something dark and inevitable grew stronger with every turn of the wheel. When I arrived home, I found the lock undisturbed and the door securely shut. For a moment, that gave me a bit of peace, but the second I stepped into the living room and flicked on the light, my heart stopped. There, sitting on my couch with a gun in his hand, was the man from the shop. His face was expressionless, but in his eyes there was something unutterably sinister. He motioned to the chair, and I, almost powerless, sank into it, feeling the blood drain from my face. The man sat silently, as if waiting for me to start speaking, but I couldn't say a word, so he began instead. His voice was cold, like steel. How is he doing? Does he understand where he is and who he is? I could hear my own breathing, slowing with terror, but I managed to nod and replied that he remembered who he was. He still thinks he's a doctor and believes he's helped many, I said, trying not to meet the man's eyes. Suddenly he erupted, his face twisted with rage, and he knocked the lamp off the table. Shards scattered across the floor, and I pressed myself against the back of the chair, trembling. "Don't you dare call him that," he shouted with a fury that seemed to fill the room, pushing out the air. His hands shook, and I realized that I was looking at a man driven not just by hatred, but by something far deeper. Something that would push him to the most horrifying acts. When he had calmed down somewhat, he set the gun on the table and looked at me with a slight smirk. "You're in danger. That man isn't just a doctor. He's a monster who spent years perfecting his art of torture and control. I know you can feel it." He paused, then continued, "You can still avoid this if you help me." His words rolled out like a quiet rumble of thunder. There was no regret in his eyes, only a deep conviction. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something terrifying, with no way to back away. I sat there motionless, feeling his words seep into my consciousness like poison, dissolving the last remnants of my former certainty. He stared at me, waiting for a response, but I had nothing to say. The only thing I managed was to ask the question spinning in my mind. "Why are you here? Why did you come to me?" His face grew almost thoughtful for a moment before he spoke. "I was there, in that cursed care home," he began, his voice quiet but no less ominous. "I was one of those who forgot themselves, who forgot their own lives. I was his patient too, but I managed to escape." My eyes widened in horror, but he went on. "When I came to my senses, I realized I'd forgotten almost everything. I vaguely remembered that I'd once been a detective, investigating a family's disappearance. They were human rights advocates who had helped many in our community, but one day they simply vanished. I was leading the investigation. It was complicated, and my superiors had forbidden me from pursuing it, so I worked in secret. I admit I obtained some evidence through unconventional means, but the trail led me all the way to that care home. I vaguely recall planning my infiltration, but after that, I remember nothing. I assume my plan failed, and that's how I became another patient." He paused as though the memory stirred something painful within him. "I survived because by chance I missed a dose of the Omega compound. All it took was an expired peach yogurt after one of those so-called communions. I vomited the dose out when I got home, unseen. By evening, I could already sense myself as a person again, and by morning I realized the trap I was in. So I decided to act normally, to study their system. My absence from group activities was such a minor deviation that no one noticed. I pretended to comply, and that's what kept me alive," he said, his voice sharpening, and I saw a flicker of fear and fury in his eyes. He turned to me, lost in memories again. "I witnessed horrors. Once an old man named Tom tripped during a tennis tournament in that damned care home and hit his head. In the first few seconds, a crowd gathered around him as he convulsed on the court floor, some calling for help. But then one of the staff ordered everyone to resume their activities. In an instant, all the patients moved away from the dying Tom like a school of fish, ignoring their friend and going back to their game. There were sounds of rackets hitting, laughter from spectators, the cries of players. It was as though Tom no longer existed, as if he'd vanished the moment they were told to forget him and be happy. And they obeyed. 2 more staff members arrived with a stretcher. Tom kept twitching, and one of the attendants simply snapped his neck to make it easier to place him on the gurney. None of the patients reacted to the murder. They looked right through him, their minds filtering out the reality. The staff rolled his body away, leaving a slow-spreading sticky pool of blood on the tennis court. People stepped in it, smearing it with their footprints because they'd been ordered not to see it. It was horrific. The next day, no one remembered Tom. That's the Omega compound effect. A new day starts like a blank page. You remember where the cafe or bathroom is, the name of the person you're speaking to, But as for what happened yesterday, you don't know. All that remains are faint images, and the worst part is, it doesn't bother you. You feel that everything is fine, that it's how it's supposed to be. You must be happy because this monster, Father Bartholomew, has already taken care of all your problems. I forced myself to respond, gripping the reality of the plan he was laying out, though everything within me recoiled. His face grew even harder, his fists clenched, and a grim resolve filled his voice. You must understand this isn't just a coincidence. The care home was a place for those who stood in the way, those who knew too much, those who posed a threat to the powerful. They were locked away, stripped of their identities, and turned into silent puppets, so they could never again harm those with influence. Perfect eradication. No body, no case. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. Everything he said felt like a horrifying dream, yet I knew I wasn't asleep. I asked a question I perhaps shouldn't have, a question whose answer I might be better off not knowing. But how did you escape? He looked at me with a heavy weariness and replied, I set a fire. Unfortunately, Bartholomew survived. Now I intend to finish what I started. He looked me straight in the eyes, and his gaze held not just rage, it held a consuming hatred, a thirst for vengeance. The air in the room felt heavier, and I realized I was looking at a man willing to do anything to achieve his goal. He continued, You can help me. That monster trusts you. Maybe you've piqued his interest. You'll be able to get access to places no one else can reach. I sat there not knowing what to say. My life hung by a thread, and I understood that agreeing would drag me into a world steeped in darkness and violence. Yet something inside me warned that refusing might be even more dangerous. This man seemed ready to destroy anything in his path to obliterate Bartholomew. I nodded, feeling that with every word he spoke, I drew closer to a decision that would change my life forever. We sat across from each other, enveloped in a silence that pressed down on me like a leaden weight. He studied me as if trying to ensure I fully grasped the gravity of his request. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and said, You can stay out of it and do nothing, but if you do, you'll be part of his game. He's already chosen you, and to refuse is to become his victim, part of his twisted experiment. His words pierced my mind like daggers. I realized I had no choice but to agree. Every instinct warned me that staying here with this man, with his cold gaze, was as dangerous as standing before Father Bartholomew. But now I knew there was no turning back. I nodded, and a dark smile crossed his face. Not mere satisfaction, but the exultation of someone who had finally obtained the weapon he needed for revenge. He stood, his voice even colder than before. Here's what you need to do. You'll go to 7th Eden, Bartholomew's care home. It seems you've earned some small level of his trust, as much as a cold-blooded animal can trust a person. You'll need to arrange an interview, an internship, or even just a visit there. I need to know where he is. You don't have to get hired or stay there. Just find a reason to go. Maybe you're scouting it out for a relative in need of care. You can go, take a look, then decline, saying it's too far, or that other relatives disagree. No risk to you, but it'll help in a vital way. I felt that something crucial lay at the heart of this stranger's plan. I asked, Will you arrest him later? Will I need to testify in court? No, you'll be completely safe. You have nothing to worry about. I have to finish this myself. You don't have to play his game. Just visit the care home. He handed me a nondescript hair clip. Take this with you. That way I'll know where you are and can get you out if anything goes terribly wrong, which I doubt. His eyes glinted in the dim room light. He extended his phone to me and said, When you find something important, get in touch. Just remember, Bartholomew has allies in this world. If anyone asks why you're there, say you're simply looking into it for a relative. No unnecessary conversation. He stood, and I felt his shadow swallow up all the light in the room. His words like chains bound me to the plan, and although I still doubted, I understood there was no way back. He looked at me one last time, then left my apartment without a sound. I heard the door close behind him, and silence filled the room once more. The next day I went to the hospital to discuss an internship with Father Bartholomew, only to find he was no longer there. Even after paying a nurse to check his medical records for contact details, I came up empty-handed. There was no record of Father Bartholomew in the hospital's files. It was as though he'd never been there. Feeling slightly unnerved, I wandered into the hospital cafe. I sat there, lost in thought for about 5 minutes, then took out the card he'd given me. White, made from a smooth, pleasant paper. After a brief pause, I dialed the number. On the other end, a soft, slightly velvety, artificial-sounding female voice answered. 7th Eden Care Home. This is Beatrice. How may I assist you? Stammering slightly, I explained that I'd met Father Bartholomew in the hospital, and he'd given me this number in case I had questions. And, well, I was thinking about a care home for my Aunt Elena. Would it be possible to take a preliminary tour? Of course, Beatrice's voice grew sugary and eager to please. Bring your aunt, and we'll show you everything. Introduce you to the staff, the residents. We're completely transparent and open. Elena is a bit stubborn, I continued, trying to keep my tone steady. I'd like to take a look on my own first to be sure I can convince her. The woman replied in a tone that was nothing short of reverential. You're absolutely right. A splendid idea. And since you come to us through Father Bartholomew himself, you'll receive special attention. I'll send you the instructions. After answering a few additional questions and ending the call, I set the phone down. A sensation washed over me, like I'd just been doused with murky water. It seemed like just a customer-oriented approach, yet something in their manner felt invasive and unsettling. I expected the message to contain the address of the care home, but instead it instructed me to be at home at a specific time. There was nothing to do but comply with this odd invitation. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of tense anticipation. Right on time, a black minivan pulled up, gleaming with immaculate polish. The driver opened the door, revealing an unexpectedly luxurious interior. 7 free seats, a folding table with a champagne bucket, a refrigerator, and a brand new television. The air conditioning hummed, creating a cozy atmosphere. The driver mentioned that they used the van for tours, so relatives could fully immerse themselves in the experience of citizens of 7th Eden. The word citizens fell from his lips as though he spoke of an independent nation rather than a care facility. The van rolled forward smoothly, and friends played on the television, allowing me to relax. I took a sip of champagne, and for a fleeting moment, I convinced myself everything was fine. But then it hit me. This van, the driver had said, had been in use for years, yet it looked brand new, without a scratch. My nerves flared up again. Was I noticing oddities or just winding myself up? Another sip, and a wave of drowsiness began to pull me under. I awoke to the feeling of being moved. With effort, I opened my eyes and saw I was being pushed along a street in a wheelchair. My body was weak, my arms barely able to move, and my legs numb. Behind me, a young orderly spoke. You felt unwell during the drive. Don't worry, we'll take good care of you. His voice was calm, indifferent. I couldn't respond, only stare ahead. It was a narrow street lined with rows of small houses, like hastily assembled film set props. People lingered in the windows, silently watching me pass, as if welcoming a new member to their society. They wheeled me toward a shaded area with chess tables set up under the trees. People sat by the tables, staring blankly at untouched pieces. On one of the benches in a wheelchair sat my Aunt Elena. Horror stirred inside me, but I couldn't speak. I managed only a hoarse, incoherent sound, unable to control the saliva pooling at the corners of my mouth. The orderly leaned in and said softly, "You were right. Your aunt needs help. Here, she'll become new." Our wheelchairs aligned. My aunt was staring off into the distance as if she didn't see me. Her gaze was empty. Her face relaxed as though she'd withdrawn into herself forever. A horrible mix of regret, guilt, and helplessness tore at me, rending me into thousands of pieces. The orderly pushed me onward. "It's time for confession," he said. "You weren't honest with us. Now it's time to meet with Father Bartholomew." We approached a church building that had been converted from an old Anglican chapel. They wheeled me through the central entrance, where I saw an imposing throne, and there, seated on it, was Father Bartholomew. They wheeled me to the center of the church, the chair's wheels thudding dully on the cold stone floor. I struggled to hold my head up, but the world around me still felt hazy. Looming before me was the throne, majestic yet sinister, a perverse mockery of what a church should stand for. Seated upon it was Father Bartholomew, his figure like a statue carved by time and the suffering of others. His gaze, however, was very much alive, brimming with that monstrous conviction in the righteousness of his deeds. I could feel his unblinking eyes on me, piercing past my skin, as though searching for my very essence. His scarred face was a grotesque mask, beneath which something monstrous and yet disturbingly compelling flickered. He began to speak, and the sound of his voice unsettled me, each word sharp and cold like a stone striking glass. "Today," he declared, like a preacher at the gallows, "we gather not for repentance but for purification." His words rang with solemn grandeur, and yet every syllable carried an undercurrent of malicious force. He spoke of duty, of freedom from weakness and fear, as though he believed he would deliver us all. But by his definition, freedom meant complete submission. "We offer a new beginning, liberation from vices," he continued. "But true purity is only achieved through communion, and only this communion can grant you freedom from yourself." I tried to avert my gaze, but something held me, compelling me to listen. At some point, I noticed the orderly beside me methodically preparing a syringe. His cold fingers inspected the ampule filled with the transparent liquid, the omega compound Bartholomew had just described. I felt a dread that this was not going to be just a simple injection. The orderly approached, syringe in hand, and I felt my heart pound wildly. Every muscle in my body refused to respond. It was hard to breathe, as though the air itself had thickened to tar. Father Bartholomew continued his sermon, seemingly addressing not me but all the unseen, non-existent souls he intended to purify. His voice drummed in my head, mingling with the frantic beating of my heart. The orderly came closer, took my arm, and lifted it slightly to expose the vein. I couldn't even flinch. A sharp pain shot through my skin as the needle slid in, and the liquid began to fill my veins. The world around me grew blurrier. Father Bartholomew's voice faded, as though I were sinking into fog. His words echoed in my ears, but I could no longer grasp their meaning. An unnatural, eerie euphoria washed over me, as though everything within me softened, dissolved, and vanished. I closed my eyes and began to sink into vague visions. Fragmented scenes floated before me. A brightly lit room as if in an art class, paint, brushes, a stern voice. Then a flash, and I was back in the church. Among blank stares, people who didn't see each other. I glimpsed an apple strudel on a white plate, then found myself in a hall where people played squash. The ball ricocheted off walls, thuds of rubber, and back to the church again. All these scenes blurred together, preventing me from clinging to anything familiar or tangible. For a moment, it felt as if I were these images themselves, that myself didn't exist at all. But suddenly the world shifted, and I was overwhelmed by the stench of decay and wet earth. Struggling to open my eyes, I found myself in a dark, damp space, narrow walls slick with mold. It felt like I'd awoken in a ditch, or perhaps an abandoned purification station. My body ached, my skin scraped, fingers throbbing from cold and pain. Beside me lay a portable blood-cleansing device, strangely and disturbingly familiar. A cable stretched from my arm, a foreign invasive tether. In the distance, I heard muffled gunshots. First one, then another, and another. I realized that he, the man with the scarred face who had once come to me, was likely here, having tracked me by that cursed brooch with GPS. He was closing in. This could be my only chance to escape, and I had to seize it. Mustering all my strength, I unhooked the cable, a wave of nausea washing over me at the sudden severance from the device. I knew there wasn't much time. I had to find my aunt and get out while there was even a sliver of hope. Through the pain and dizziness, I managed to rise to my feet and, stumbling, moved toward a building that looked like part of an old clinic. Making my way toward the clinic, I clung to the shadows, feeling each rustle, each step, reverberate painfully in my exhausted legs. The clinic, which was connected to the church by a lavish passageway, seemed as though it had been hastily abandoned. Windows empty, yet faint remnants of flickering lights visible inside, muddy footprints and stains on the floors, like traces of a rushed evacuation. Once inside, I moved as quietly as I could, heading toward the nearest office. Horrifying thoughts of what might have happened to my aunt propelled me forward. In the first office I entered, there was a metal table and folders stacked haphazardly on the walls. I began rifling through the documents until I came upon one that made my heart stop. Folders filled with reports, each one appearing like a dossier. Skimming the pages, I saw entries that sent chills down my spine. The reports were written in a dry, businesslike tone, reminiscent of expense sheets. Yet here, they concerned people. Phrases like disposal due to low utility coefficient and removal from program based on performance indicators appeared again and again. I nearly lost consciousness when I came across my aunt's name. Next to it was the notation that she'd been disposed of as worthless, her fate determined with as little regard as if she were broken equipment. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I heard a rustling behind me. Father Bartholomew, as if materializing from the shadows, stood at the doorway. His bionic prosthetics gleamed under the dim room light, brand new and coldly mechanical. His face was motionless, but a glint of that same chilling fire burned in his eyes, the fire I had seen before. There was no regret in his gaze, no hint of remorse, as though all this was part of his grand design, in which he was unquestionably right. "You wanted the truth," he said, his voice calm but laced with mockery. "I hope now you understand just how weak the world you lived in truly is. A world devoid of higher purpose is nothing but chaos." Suppressing the terror that gripped me, I lunged at him, overcome with rage. A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, as if he hadn't expected such resolve. Accustomed to relying on his strength and authority, he didn't even try to defend himself, confident he could handle me easily. But years spent in a coma and the burns that ravaged his body had taken their toll. His movements were slow, clumsy. I struck him in the stomach, then grabbed his head, gathering all my strength, and smashed it against the corner of the table. His body swayed, but he didn't relent, his expression remaining scornful as if marveling at where I'd found such strength. I hit him again, until I felt him slump to the floor, and only then did I allow myself to step back, gripping the table for support. Tears streamed down my face, tears of pain, despair, the loss of my aunt, and the darkness that had swallowed me whole. Suddenly I heard heavy footsteps behind me. The man with the scarred face entered the room, a pistol in his hand. His wound bled, his clothes were smeared with dirt, but his eyes burned with determination. He glanced at Bartholomew's fallen figure, then at me. "We have to go," he said, and I noticed he was carrying a small gas canister. We quickly devised a plan to set up a diversion. While he rigged the canister, I gathered what little strength I had left and helped him activate the device to delay anyone from pursuing us. The scent of gas filled the room, and we bolted for the exit. Outside, we reached the car and tried to start it. The scarred man darted toward the gate to open it, but as soon as he unlatched it, a gunshot rang out, and he collapsed. I rushed to his side, but he was already dead, and I realized, through clenched teeth, that my only chance of escape was to get behind the wheel and drive away. The first rays of dawn began to break through the mist as I made it past the gate and out onto the empty highway. The miles of emptiness stretched before me, endless as memories of my aunt and all the people who might never find peace echoed in my mind. I kept driving, feeling the void around me consuming me, yet fear and adrenaline pushed me forward. Morning light grew as the city receded behind me, and with every passing mile, it became harder to hold on to reality. The road felt like it was lulling me, each sign and curve dissolving into a foggy gray haze. I felt drained like an empty shell, incapable of thought or feeling. Eventually, a small town appeared in the distance. The houses were low with peeling paint, like in a place where life had once thrived but had gradually faded. On the outskirts, I saw a building that looked like a sheriff's station and without hesitation pulled up to it. As soon as the car stopped, I practically fell out, feeling my legs give way beneath me. Inside, I encountered the sheriff, a man in his 50s with a heavy gaze and a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. He looked at me without much interest, and it was clear he'd already decided I was just another crazed person wandering in. "Please help," I breathed out, my voice hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken for hours. "There in the city, the church, the care home." The sheriff looked me up and down skeptically, his gaze lingering on my dirty, torn hands, but he remained rooted in place. "Calm down, ma'am. Let's sit, talk. Take a breath and tell me what happened," he said politely, though there was a guarded edge to his voice. I tried to explain, but the words refused to form coherent sentences. The story sounded too insane even to my own ears. Horrifying reports, human liquidation, Father Bartholomew, the Omega compound. Eventually, the sheriff cut me off, glancing over at his deputy, a young man named Charlie, who had been standing nearby, listening intently to our conversation. "Charlie," the sheriff said with a hint of irritation, "show the lady to a cell. She needs to cool down." "But," I began, feeling panic rise in my chest again. "You don't understand. You have to check this place, please. There are people." The sheriff frowned, clearly unwilling to waste any more time on my pleas, and nodded at Charlie, who escorted me down the hall. I found myself in a small holding cell, the iron gate clanging shut behind me. Tears of frustration stung my eyes. I didn't know how much longer I could endure this. Charlie lingered by the cell door, clearly debating what he'd heard. Finally, he turned hesitantly to the sheriff. "Maybe we should check it out," he said. "She's clearly not faking it. Something happened out there. She wouldn't be like this if it hadn't." The sheriff sighed irritably, but after a moment's hesitation, he waved his hand dismissively. After a brief debate, they decided to release me from the cell, agreeing to let me show them where it all happened. We set off toward the care home in the patrol car. Joining us was a local school teacher who also freelanced as a journalist, occasionally writing articles for the town paper. I realized this was their way of fact-checking my story, to gather some sort of proof. But they were so calm, so sure that my story would turn out to be nonsense, that I struggled to hold back the urge to scream. When we arrived at the site, I froze in shock. Where the church and care home had stood, there was now only bare, level ground. Everything that had once been there was leveled to the ground. Heavy equipment tracks were visible, and in the distance I could see piles of rubble and wheel marks from trucks that must have hauled everything away. The sheriff and his deputy exchanged puzzled looks, while the teacher journalist shook his head, leaning out of the car and pulling out a camera to snap a few pictures. But I just stood there, staring at the emptiness, feeling the world crumble around me. "Looks like you were mistaken, ma'am," the sheriff said, with a hint of sympathy in his voice. "There's nothing here, and judging by these tracks, there hasn't been for quite some time." I knew this was no mistake. It was a deliberate erasure of every last piece of evidence. The care home was gone, and now anything I could say would sound like nothing more than the ravings of a madwoman. They didn't believe a single word. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.